The thunder of hooves, which shook the peaceful Virginia air on the morning of June 9, 1863, was the herald of the largest cavalry battle ever fought on American soil. By evening, the untarnished reputation of the Confederate cavalry under Jeb Stuart had begun to fade a little. But even as the rebel star began to wane, a new name had begun its meteoric rise to fame, a name that would forever grace America's Military Hall of Fame: George Armstrong Custer. On the 5th of June, 1863, General Jeb Stuart held a grand review of the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia. 10,000 hard-bitten veterans of the Confederacy paraded past the salutary base and performed a number of exercises to the accompaniment of cannon fire and cheering from the assembled crowds. In the evening, a grand ball was held. These men had enjoyed an uninterrupted series of victories over their Yankee counterparts, stretching back unbroken to 1861. And they were justifiably proud of their own record and the glittering reputation of their illustrious commander, J.E.B. Stuart, better known to history as Jeb. This was to be the finest hour for his command, the absolute zenith of Southern confidence and pride in Southern arms. The glittering review of the 5th, however, was not graced by the revered figure of Robert E. Lee, a man idolized and worshipped by his men. Lee had been engaged elsewhere on important business. Undeterred, Stuart organized a second grand review for the sole benefit of the great general on the 8th of June. The whole glittering spectacle was once again followed by another ball. This conspicuous excess caused a few eyebrows to be raised, especially among those who began to wonder if Stuart's eyes might have been diverted from his real purpose by the seductive allure of the pomp and splendor of martial display. Not for nothing was the phrase "pride comes before a fall" bandied around the army. These dark mutterings were loud enough to reach even the ears of Major Heros von Bork, the Inspector General of the rebel cavalry. They grumbled at the useless waste of energy, especially that of the horses. Furthermore, they complained that the command was being worried out by military foppery and display. What had been called the finest light cavalry in the world appeared to be in danger of overconfidence.
Cavalrymen, by their very nature, are filled with dash, drive, the idea of being very impressive to the ladies, and so forth. So you can say right through history there have been examples of cavalry, shall we put it, getting out of control, maybe, and part of that will be due to their sublime self-confidence. I can say that as a person who knows many modern cavalry officers here at Sandhurst, for example. They are of a type. Examples, you've got the Scots Greys, of course, at Waterloo, not stopping at their objective, but charging straight on for the enemy guns, and thereby being massacred. You have very much the same thing happening, of course, at Balaclava under different circumstances. Cavalry again, carrying out an impossible order, but with great dash, panache, bravado. But it's a fact, a lot of cavalry, particularly light cavalry, the heavier ones seem to be rather more, shall we say, careful about the use of their power and military. But you do have a penchant amongst cavalrymen of all countries, of all ages, the light cavalrymen, of being slightly, shall we say, devil-may-care. But it is strange that history has got quite a few examples, and indeed the Gettysburg campaign has one too, of cavalry going out on great, what you might call military parades, really, rather than anything totally useful for the war. There's a case of John of Gaunt's Grand Chevauchée, or Great Horse Ride, in the 14th century, when he went right through the centre of France for about 4 weeks and came back to where he started off with, having fought no battle, having burnt no villages, having done nothing at all except possibly impress the local people with the splendour of the cavalry. And we may well find Jeb Stuart before this, as a result of the Battle of Brandy Station, being tempted to do something of the same sort in 1863.
There was indeed an element of conspicuous display on the part of the Confederates, which in military terms could probably be justified by the boost it gave to the morale of the men. The 10,000 horsemen gathered together by Stuart was to be the largest ever assembled by the Confederacy, and they undoubtedly made an imposing presence. But the ostentatious show of June 5th did not go unmissed by the Federal Intelligence Network. John Buford, the commander of the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division only 12 miles away at Warrington Junction, filed this fairly accurate report on June 5th. All of the available cavalry of the Confederacy is in Culpeper County. Stuart, the two Lees, Robertson, Jenkins, and Jones are all there. The Confederate cavalry force which so concerned Buford had won its spurs the hard way in 2 years of battle with the numerically stronger and even better supplied enemy. That's not to say, however, that Stuart's men were without fault. They were hard fighters for sure, but they were also highly undisciplined with a large streak of arrogance which showed from the top down, and this could lead to moments of extreme discomfort for the Confederate High Command. Their lack of discipline sprang chiefly from the fact that they were all volunteers who supplied their own horses. They were there because they believed in their cause and because they wanted to be. The superior attitude of the Confederate cavalry with regard to their own merits is best summed up by one who was there. George Baylor fought throughout the war in the ranks of the 12th Virginia Cavalry. Although he was of English extraction, by 1863 Baylor was nonetheless as loyal a rebel soldier as any. He described in his memoirs the reaction of the proud rebel cavalrymen to the arrival of a rule-bound brigadier general.
One morning, just prior to the Culpeper fight, I was surprised at the number of absentees during roll call in Company B. I frankly disclosed the fact that some of these boys had gone home, some to get fresh horses, others to get winter clothing, and I assured him that they would be back in a few days. The general then said, "Do you think they'll ever come back?" To which I replied indignantly, "I know that they will come back. They are gentlemen." "Well," said the Downey General, "I will have some of these gentlemen shot." I mounted and returned to camp, consoling myself with the thought that if any of those gentlemen were shot, then a general, not so much a gentleman, would be shot also.
The Confederate Army was, of course, a rebel army. And rebel armies, right through history, have had a tendency towards indiscipline, though not, I must say, in every single case. But for good examples, there's the period of the Jacobite Revolt in the 45, when, although the rebel Scots, Highlanders, did not actually loot much in their advance to Derby, yet they tended to go home when they felt things were going a bit adverse for the cause. And the same thing had happened the previous century at Sedge Moor, when Lord Faversham suddenly finds that he's facing Monmouth's army, which had been something like 6,000 only 2 weeks before. He's only got 4,000 facing him at the Battle of Sedge Moor, because again, they've gone home. Other examples that spring to mind, of course, is Washington's Continental Army, which in its early days was highly indisciplined. Indeed, there were a number of major mutinies, and officer mutinies at that, not the rank and file refusing to soldier anymore, words to that effect. Garibaldi had a great deal of trouble in Italy with many sections of his red shirts. They were free men fighting for a cause, and they believed, therefore, their interpretation of their role was very much up to them. And that tends to be a feature of rebel armies. And, of course, there are other examples of very highly disciplined rebel troops. Can't imagine anything more disciplined than Oliver Cromwell's Ironside, heavy cuirassier cavalry in the English Civil War. They would rally after the charge, ready to fight again, and were way ahead in terms of professionalism than Prince Rupert's famous dashing cavaliers who never knew when to stop but would disappear off the battlefield after a local success to go and loot the baggage and things of that nature. So we have to be careful here. It goes either way. So in general terms, it is true to say that cavalry of a rebel army, and indeed the infantry of a rebel army for that matter too, have a tendency to be indisciplined.
Despite this lack of polish, the Confederate cavalry had proved more than a match for the Union horsemen in every battlefield so far in the war. They looked upon the Yankees with undisguised scorn and considered themselves so superior to the Federal cavalry that it was almost beneath contempt, a mounted joke to be ridiculed and made fun of at every turn. Baylor summed up the superior attitude of the rebels in his memoirs when he mischievously related the confusion caused in the mind of the U.S. Brigadier General White, discomfited by the presence of a much smaller force of rebel cavalry at Winchester in 1862.
The Yankee pickets and outposts were daily attacked, and communication between Winchester and Harper's Ferry broken. General White, unable to keep the way open, became so much alarmed that after sparking many of his larger guns and destroying a large amount of his ammunition, well, he hastily evacuated Winchester, retiring on Harper's Ferry. Now, actually threatening him were about 100 men of our company, but this is how he described us in his letter to General Halleck. Martinsburg, West Virginia, September 6, 1862. General, I have the honor to report that in accordance with the telegraphic order of Major General Halleck, the troops under my command evacuated the fortifications near Winchester, Virginia, falling back on Harper's Ferry without opposition. Owing to the authenticated presence of 3 or 4 brigades of the enemy in the valley, it was impracticable to bring all the government property accumulated at the post. Poor White. He magnified one company into 3 brigades, and in his great haste to get away, his imagination created intentions and embodied things unknown to him.
To a large extent, Baylor's mock sympathy was not altogether misplaced. The Federal cavalry had indeed performed very poorly so far in the war. They were easily spooked and quick to retreat. Numerous shake-ups, changes, and rearrangements had all failed to produce results. On the eve of the Battle of Brandy Station, the latest set of changes had just taken place, with Alfred Pleasonton assuming command of the Federal Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, a force of some 11,000 men whom he found in a very sorry state. In taking this command, I cannot do myself such an injustice as to remain silent as to the unsatisfactory condition in which I find this corps. I shall use every exertion to bring it to a state of efficiency at the earliest possible moment. So dismal was the performance of the Federal cavalry that the favorite rhetorical question asked by the long-suffering infantryman had become, "Whoever saw a dead cavalryman?" This hoary old line had even been uttered by generals of repute, Hooker included, who was less than complimentary towards the cavalry arm. In his reply to Pleasonton's initial dismal report on the Cavalry Corps, he replied, "The general desires that you will spare no labor to place the cavalry in a high state of efficiency at the earliest practicable moment. He cannot but feel that the force of this arm has been greatly impaired from want of system, organization, and judicious employment." If the overall performance of the Cavalry Corps was less than outstanding, it was not for want of good material. Properly led and organized, the men were undoubtedly capable of great feats of valor. In their ranks were some very brave and courageous young soldiers. Among them, the young George Armstrong Custer, who had become an American legend in the war. But even his youthful vigor and unflinching bravery were tinged by naivete. In the early years of the war, the inexperienced young men who composed the bulk of the Federal Cavalry Corps were always likely to be outfought by their proud foe, for whom the horse was a way of life. He left us this account of his first action.
I realized that I was in front of a company of old and experienced soldiers, all of whom would have an eye upon their new lieutenant to see how he comported himself when under fire. As we rode toward the enemy on the other side of the hill, Lieutenant Walker anxiously inquired of me, "Custer, what weapon are you going to use in the charge?" From my earliest notions of the true cavalryman, I'd always pictured him bearing aloft his curved saber and cleaving the skulls of all that came in contact with it. So I promptly replied, "The saber." Oh, but could you have seen some of the charges that were made? While thinking of them, I cannot but exclaim, glorious war.
At this stage in that glorious war, the vice-like hands of economic strangulation had yet to fasten upon the Confederacy. Southern spirits were still high, and these high spirits were echoed in the ranks of the leaders. The revered leader of the horsemen, against whom the young Custer would be pitted, was Jeb Stuart. In 1863, Stuart was approaching the pinnacle of his fame. He basked in the public adoration which resulted from the undisputed superiority his Confederate cavalry enjoyed over its Federal opponents. With Stuart in Culpeper County were 5 full cavalry brigades, each of about 2,000 men. They were supported by a battalion of horse artillery numbering 24 guns, with a further 4 guns permanently attached to Jones's brigade. In command of the 1st Brigade was Brigadier General Wade Hampton. Next came Brigadier General Fitzhugh Lee, the second son of Robert E. Lee. In command of the 3rd Brigade was his cousin Rooney Lee, nephew of the great commander. Brigadier William Jones, better known as Grumble, commanded the next brigade. And finally, there was Beverly Robertson's brigade. Jeb Stuart, the leader of this grand assembly, was a colorful man whose cavalier attitude and love of life could be seen in his love of music. Attached to Stuart's command was a virtuoso banjo player by the name of Sampson D. Sweeney. Nominally, he was a courier, but in reality, he was the key to bringing color and life to an otherwise drab military scene. A musician par excellence who lifted the spirits of all who heard him. Stuart loved his banjo music and would command Sweeney to play for them at every available opportunity. Wherever Stuart went, Sweeney went too. Eston Cook, a member of Stuart's staff, recollected the man. Stuart's banjo player Sweeney was the constant inmate of his tent. He rode behind him on the march and went with him to social gatherings. Stuart wrote his most important dispatches and correspondence with the rattle of the gay instrument stunning everybody. Stuart would turn round from his work, burst into a laugh, and join uproariously in Sweeney's chorus. If ever the spirit of wild and hilarious mirth spoke from any instrument, it spoke from the notes of Sweeney's banjo. Wild and hilarious indeed was the spirit of Jeb Stuart, and his men loved him for it. The soldiers of the Federal Cavalry Corps, on the other hand, had little opportunity to grow to love their commanders. The frequent changes as the Federal High Command searched in vain for a winning combination meant that there was little opportunity to develop a rapport between the commanders and their men. General Alfred Pleasanton, who now commanded the Northern Cavalry Corps, had taken over from General Stoneman on May 22nd. Only 17 days before the Battle of Brandy Station. Pleasanton's command was organized into 3 divisions of cavalry, each amounting to about 3,000 men. In theory, They were supported by a division of horse artillery, amounting to around 58 guns, although only 12 were actually present at the Battle of Brandy Station. The first of Pleasanton's divisions was commanded by Brigadier General John Buford. Next came the division of Brigadier General David Gregg. The third division was commanded by a Frenchman, Brigadier General Alfred Dufay. Also attached to Pleasanton for Brandy Station were 2 weak brigades of infantry commanded by Brigadier Generals Russell and Amos. These were attached to Buford and Gregg, respectively. Despite his extreme youth, Custer had already begun to shine in battle, and the active Pleasanton warmed to the young man and recruited him to his staff. In return, Custer gave the officer his unequivocal support and admiration.
The day I rode into Camp Falmouth, I was summoned to the headquarters tent of the 1st Cavalry Division, there to be greeted by Brigadier General Pleasanton. "Curly," he said, "I want you to be my special aide. I'll make no bones about it, you're a man after my own heart. Pure rambunction. Well, will you accept?" "Indeed I will, sir," I answered at once, and we shook on it.
These were the men of the great cavalry forces which were gathered together on June 9th, 1863. They were the largest body of horse soldiers who would ever be brought against each other in America. But the cavalry, as an important branch of the Army, was already in decline by the 1860s. It had been eclipsed by the greater firepower of the infantry. And by comparison with the vast infantry forces on the move in the procedure to Gettysburg, the cavalry forces seemed almost modest. In the vicinity of Culpeper County, Robert E. Lee had gathered his 60,000-strong Army of Northern Virginia together for a second invasion of the North. Opposing him was General Joe Hooker, with 110,000 effectives. By invading the North, Lee hoped to lure Hooker away from Richmond, thus taking the federal pressure off the hard-pressed capital of the Confederacy. After the hard-won Confederate victory at Chancellorsville, the Yankees had been content to occupy well-fortified positions and wait. Regardless of the Federal strength in numbers, the Confederates felt that provided they could lure the Federal Army into the open, they could defeat the Yankees once more. Lee therefore sought to provoke a pitched battle by moving north and encouraging the Yankees to leave their defenses. He knew if he threatened the North, they could not stay dug in and would be forced to follow. Lee was to achieve his objective, but the outcome would be rather different from the one he had intended. For the drive north would produce the terrible 3-day Battle of Gettysburg, the beginning of the end for the South. Before that dramatic event, however, there was the small matter of the great cavalry battle at Brandy Station to be settled first. Having got wind of Lee's planned invasion of the North, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, Major General Fighting Joe Hooker, knew that he had to act swiftly to prevent a recurrence of the unfortunate events of the Chancellorsville campaign. Hooker therefore ordered Pleasanton with the Federal Cavalry Corps to attack Stuart's Cavalry Corps, which had been massed for its ill-advised review in Culpeper County. With their inferior numbers, the rebels fought a mobile war. Stuart's cavalry was the eyes and ears of the rebel army on the march, and Hooker knew that their destruction would seriously hamper, if not avert, the proposed invasion. Federal intelligence believed the rebel cavalry to be still massed near Culpeper Courthouse, Virginia, a pleasant rural area of verdant farmland ideally suited for cavalry actions. Pleasanton therefore planned to trap his adversary in a 3-pronged attack. Crossing Beverly's Ford on the early morning of June 9, 1863, would be Buford's division, supported by Amos's brigade of infantry. They would clear away any opposition, then move to Culpeper. To the south at Kelly's Ford, 2 further divisions under Dufay and Gregg, with Russell's infantry, would also advance into Confederate lines. Dufay was to make for Stevensburg, then head north to rendezvous with Buford in the vicinity of Brandy Station. Following Dufay was to be Gregg's division. These men would complete the 3rd arm of the combined thrust on Brandy Station. Once joined, the 3 columns would move upon the main rebel body thought to be at Culpeper Courthouse. As aide to Pleasanton, George Armstrong Custer was present at the briefing and later recalled the scene in his memoirs.
Al, the GIC said, "Our scouts report that Lee is moving up the east side of the Blue Ridge Mountains towards Harper's Ferry. We can only suspect by this that he's planning another invasion of Maryland and Pennsylvania. We've got to stop him before he crosses the Potomac. Jeb Stuart is protecting his right with 10,000 horse. Knock out Stuart and you paralyze Lee. He can't advance without mounted protection and support, nor can he be guided with any degree of certainty. Knock him out, I say. That's the time and place to hit him. If you can't cut him to pieces, at least shake him up. Put him on the run, harass him, anything to stop Lee dead in his tracks. Take your entire corps and leave tomorrow. And bear in mind, Al, the element of surprise is essential to our success."
The element of surprise, however, was not to be the sole preserve of the Yankees. Almost as soon as they were laid, Federal plans began to go awry. Stuart's cavalry was not at Culpeper Courthouse as Hooker thought. They were, in fact, camped around the fields of Brandy Station. The clash of arms would come much sooner than expected.
Clausewitz, the famous Prussian military philosopher of earlier in the 19th century, talks a great deal about the effects of friction and uncertainty in war. If you like, the muddle factor, which almost always comes about. Von Moltke, a little later than the American Civil War, would again say very sensibly, no plan survives the first 5 minutes of battle, because war is very much the realm of the unexpected. Sometimes you get mutual surprise, as in this case at Brandy Station, when really both sides wander into each other and then suddenly find themselves in a military situation which neither had foreseen. One of the major roles of cavalry, as we have already said, is reconnaissance in battle. But here you have both cavalrymen, Jeb Stuart, the most famous cavalryman of his particular generation in America, and Pleasanton, the commander of the Union cavalry, each of them really charged with the duty of looking out and finding out about the enemy's army, wherever it happens to be, blundering into each other, as if by fate. But then, of course, Jeb Stuart has this very flashy tendency. He wants to be a Prince Murat. All cavalrymen of this period absolutely adored Prince Murat's reputation from the Napoleonic period. Full of dash and beautiful uniforms, or playing the actual banjo, or whatever it happens to be. This was meant to be the mental ethos of a cavalry commander. So I think in this case, in both these two generals, but Jeb Stuart perhaps more than Pleasanton on points, allowed themselves to be taken completely by surprise.
By the capricious hand of Providence, the entire rebel cavalry corps had planned to cross the Rappahannock River by the same ford as the Union foes, on exactly the same day. This had been intended as a prelude to a move to screen the right of